Hello and welcome to this Economist event on the future of democracy. I'm Daniel Franklin, the Economist executive and diplomatic editor. And I think it's will be clear to everybody watching that this is an absolutely vital subject, the health and the future of democracy. I'd like to thank Pew Research Center for supporting this event and making it possible, and also the speakers that we're going to be hearing from taking part in it, and this first session and in the panel session that will follow. Democracy, it's clear, is not going through a particularly good period. Even the global champion of democracy, the United States, has experienced great difficulties, a disputed election, an attack on the heartland of its democracy, the capital in Washington, D.C., lots of controversy over voting rules, a flurry of books bemoaning or expressing anxiety over the prospects for democracy there. But if you look more broadly beyond that, if you look at the various indices that are produced, our sister organization, the Economist Intelligence Unit, produces a democracy index that is showing that democracy for some years now has been going backwards. The same if you look at Freedom House's index of freedom around the world. And there is a sense that democracy is, in some cases, quite literally under attack through interference in the democratic process in various countries, and in refusal to accept sometimes the outcome of voting, and of course questions over the fairness of voting and the handling of elections, as well as the deeper concerns about the erosion of the various other elements that make up the democratic process, in the independence of institutions and freedom of the press. So there's a lot to discuss. We're going to be doing that with an expert panel in part of our discussion. But first, I'm joined by Michelle Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and of course also former president of Chile. Michelle Bachelet, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Very good to have you. Now, I've given a rather gloomy description on the state of democracy around the world. I suppose to start with, it'd be interesting to hear, do you share that gloom, or is that far too pessimistic? Are things actually better than I've described?
Well, I share what you have said, but I think we have an even deeper problem, if I may say. Because what we saw in 2019, before COVID-19, we saw that in 80 countries around the world, we had people protesting in the streets, including my own country, Chile, but in Lebanon, in Iraq, now we have seen in Colombia. So I think there is a perception on the people that democracy is not delivering, and a lack of trust on traditional institutions that are supposed to be the ones who ensure the rule of law, to ensure access to justice to everyone, etc., etc. I also have the impression that the economic system has not been delivering. And even before COVID-19, we have seen huge gaps between the rich and the poor, inside countries and within countries. So my impression, and I had it that long time ago, since 2019, is that people started feeling that the democracy, the result of democracy, were not meaning that their lives were improved. And then they started to feel that they should fight against inequalities that there were in the countries, against corruption in the countries where you have corruption, or against all these regimes where they want to perpetuate themselves forever. So I think there has been a decline in the value that is given in democracy, in particular in young people. Young people expect more than just voting and electing representatives. They want to participate more in decision making, but they also want to do it in a different way. And I also feel that political institutions, political parties have not been able to adjust themselves to the reality of the new society. We have a society that is much more horizontal, it's not vertical, and I think political institutions are still, and even political parties, because you always need certain centrality and verticality in some institutions, but political parties, I'm not sure they've been able to improve the way they relate to the people. People see politicians far away discussing issues that are not linked to their own concerns and grievances. So if I might be telling you an even gloomier perspective, but that's my real perspective of what is democracy, why democracy today is not being felt like the solution. I still feel that is the best possible, I would say, political system. But I think we need to revisit it and rethink how much changes we have to do it so that it really can deliver for the people.
It's the old idea that it's the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried out. So it's not perfect. But I wonder if in all this gloom there is any chink of light. I mean, as you point out, these problems have been visible for some time, for some years now. Do you see any signs of the system adjusting, not fast enough, as you say, but nevertheless responding to the kinds of changes, the kind of different society that you say?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, let me tell you, first of all, a negative trend with COVID-19 that has aggravated the problem is that in almost 50 countries, they have established these special measures, but that not only the ones that are necessary for the health response, but more of them limiting civic space, limiting freedom of press, freedom of expression, and they have maintained this special measures for, if I would say, longer than needed. That's a negative trend. But the positive trend that I see, I'm not sure if the structures have been changing dramatically. I think in some countries, parliaments have been dealing with some of these issues, discussing some bills that could improve the quality of democracy, trying to improve the levels of participation of different sectors of the society, more women, indigenous, etc. Some countries have decided that they need to discuss a new constitution so they can ensure that the whole model is adapted to what the country needs. But also see other positive trends, and I think that, and you mentioned the US when you started, I think people are willing to participate, and I think the turnout in the US 2020 presidential election is the highest for 120 years, and that's very positive. And even though we are mentioning all these protests, all these people on the street, that is also positive. People want to participate, want their voices to be heard, and participation is also part of the true democracy. So I think, and also we have all these movements, Me Too, the movements of Black Lives Matter, and so on. So people, because one of the more, I would feel, from my point of view, one of the worst dangers of democracy is when you have sort of a silent majority and people are not participating, they have no channels, because that could lead to populism or to violent ways of expressing themselves. And I think one of the biggest probably challenges that many democracies have is to understand that when people are protesting, they need to hear of those concerns, they need to look at it and look how they address it. And they need to understand that there are root causes for that, and they have to address those root causes. Otherwise, and that then it will be possible a dialogue, a political solution to all kinds of problems that societies have to face.
So engagement is key in this, and also, as you said, participation. You've been particularly mentioned women participating at higher levels. There's something that you particularly championed in Chile. Isn't that more broadly quite a positive aspect, that the number of candidates who are women, the number of women in senior political positions has been growing, and the engagement of half the world's population has increased substantially, at least in some parts of the world?
Yes, I mean, we understand that 50% of the world are female, so we need to consider them. And it's funny because in some documents you still read minorities, that minorities such as women, children, etc. But no, they're not minorities. But I think gender equality and non-discrimination, because it's not only about gender, also about other sectors of society, are really important for a true democracy. And I think that everyone should have the possibility to influence the decisions that affect them, their lives. And in that sense, the issue of having more women candidates being elected in some countries, more female candidates, I think there is some progress on women's representation in political life, but it's advancing very slow. You know that at the current rate, no gender parity in national legislators until 2063, and there will be no equal number, if ever, of head of state or head of governments, men and women, until it's calculated 2150. So really, we're still going very slow. So that's why we need sustained efforts. We need to proactive and targeted actions, and particular things that really work well as electoral quotas, or other special measures to promote women's political participation.
So I'd like to tie this now to. Yeah, well, obviously a lot of work still to be done. I'd like to tie this to your portfolio now of human rights. So what do you see as the connection between democracy and human rights, and how do you promote democracy in your work on human rights at the UN?
Well, I think it's completely relevant, the respect for human rights to a real democracy. Because for free elections to be fair and to be free, it's indispensable that you can ensure rights to freedom of expression, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, the right to education, non-discrimination, and accountability. You have to respect all of that if you really want to ensure free and fair elections. That's why I think that it's so important that governments should respect human rights and democratic principles, not only because they are obliged on many conventions and treaty bodies they have signed and obligations they have established under the international law, but also because, and I always use the word, it's not only the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do, because I feel that when you ensure that your democratic society is grounded in human rights, and in that sense, the Agenda 2030 of the UN is really important, because it would ensure not only political and civil rights that are important indeed, but also economic, social, cultural rights, environmental rights, etc., that will permit that people will feel that they belong. Because one of the problems I feel with those more vulnerable and discriminated groups of the societies, they don't feel that anybody cares, they feel they're left behind and they don't belong. And I think that when you are able to include all the people in the benefits of a shared prosperity, if I may say, you will have more peaceful and cohesive and just societies. And that is also the smartest thing to do as a government and as a politician.
So I suppose the inequality agenda also plays into this here. So how much of that is part of what is related to the work that you do? You said that people don't feel that democracy is often delivering for them. That's partly because there are evident inequalities in the world, in some cases growing inequalities.
Yeah, since I arrived,
how central is this to the whole problem?
It is very central. It is really essential, because and since I arrived here, of course, one of our main jobs is to ensure there's no impunity on human rights. But if we only look at the result and we don't go to the root causes, we will continue seeing human rights violations and abuses all over the world. Because many of the situations that you see, the root causes are inequalities, different kinds of inequalities. It can be gender, ethnic, religious inequalities, race inequalities, etc. So one of the things that we have been trying to do is to look at those root causes and try to give the human rights-based approach in looking at those inequalities and feeling how we really are able to identify who are the most vulnerable and discriminated people in every society, not because they're inherently vulnerable, it's because they have been historically marginalized and discriminated, and their human rights are being violated. So we have been working strongly on inequalities. And if that was clear from the beginning, for me at least, coming from a political background, I think after COVID-19 it's even more clear that inequalities have even been aggravated and exacerbated. And also we know that not everyone is affected the same way. I mean, you can have the virus, anybody can have the virus, but it affects disproportionately. It impacts the groups that are more vulnerable historically, like the Afro-descendant, like the LGBTI community, like the women and children, like older people, like people living with disabilities, migrants, refugees, and IDPs. So when we think on how we address and tackle the problems that we're facing in a democracy, we need to look at that. And what we find in the majority of the countries, that there's no disaggregated data. I mean, they can know how many women are in the country. They even can know how many old people are in the country. But the intersectionality of that is not well analyzed, not well described. And so that means that all the policies that will be developing will leave even further people behind. So that is one of the things that I've been insistent that we need to think that these are not groups that are homogeneous. You have women who are professionals, women who are poor women who are indigenous, and their impact of the inequality is completely different. And of course, the impact of conflict, climate change, etc., all these issues that also interconnect, but also the intersectionality of how people are affected is different. And I think this is something that democracy should work much more, putting people in the center of their policies, but identifying who are the ones who need the most.
So you get more granular about it, but if you get specific, and I'm sure this is one of the most challenging aspects of your job, some of the worst examples of human rights violations are in authoritarian countries and ones that have considerable power. Obviously, the prime example would be China and treatment of the Uyghurs, for example, and other cases as well. Now, in your office, you have to deal with all the nations in the world. You have to deal in powerful ones that play an important role in the UN. How do you handle that challenge? What's the balance between speaking up about these things and working with the governments that you have to work with?
Well, first of all, I want to say that, of course, democracy and human rights depend on each other. And all our work, whether it's economic, civil, electoral, political, or social rights, supports and strengthens democracy. For example, when we work on eradicating discrimination and inequalities, or when we protect human rights defenders or journalists, or when we recall the importance of privacy while using new technologies, or when we monitor human rights during elections or train police on how to manage protests. So what happens is that we have a global mandate, as you said, and we have to be impartial with countries independently of their political systems. So we assist governments so they can implement the international human rights standards they have committed to, because our mandate is the protection of human rights everywhere for everyone. So being impartial, though, does not mean remaining silent. And I speak out about human rights violations in democratic and undemocratic states alike. How we deal with it, it depends on the gravity. Sometimes, and it depends on what you think can be more, I would say, adequate to have the outcome you want. So many times we have to go public and do press release and if I would say, point out whatever we want and give the recommendations. Sometimes, and it depends, in some countries, they don't have the capacity, the technical capacity, so they need technical assistance, because my mandate is to speak out, to be the voice of the voiceless, but at the same time, engage with government, provide them with capacity building and technical assistance. And so we need to do all of that. How we do it, it will depend on the situation. It will depend on the gravity of the situation. Sometimes we do speak out. We do all our global updates on the Human Rights Council every session. We have press releases. We do briefings. We speak with governments, and we speak with civil society and with opposition in terms of knowing when there are human rights violations, that we can receive the allegations of all of that. But at the same time, we try to engage with government because we do understand that it's their obligation to respect, promote, and protect human rights. And some promote and protect some human rights, some are more, if I would say, shy, if I would say, on others. So we try to engage all of them and insist on all of them to protect, promote human rights. Sometimes when you feel or when you are asked by some family members who are in prison, etc., to have a sort of a private conversation, a sort of more diplomatic way, we choose that and we do that because, first of all, that's what they're asking us to do, the families, or some other times families are asking us to go out and speak loud. So it will depend on the situation, and there's no one, I would say there's no one single solution and one single thing that it's for all. So we use the best strategy possible, the best possible strategy.
Are you finding it possible to engage with China in this way on, for example, Xinjiang? Because the Chinese government has become much more forceful in striking back, if you like, at any criticism here, quite intolerant of any criticism. So how can you engage on that, and should you be engaging more loudly, perhaps?
Well, I have spoken in every session about the situation of human rights in China, in Xinjiang, and also about the situation in Hong Kong, and the same will happen in the next one. But we also are convinced that it's important for us to be able to visit Xinjiang and to verify in the ground what's going on. We are also monitoring from remote, and we have a lot of information already, but we want to have the possibility of a visit. Will it happen? I don't know. We have presented a proposal, and the capital, Beijing, has to come back with a proposal to us to see if I can have a credible visit, a meaningful visit with unfettered access to all the persons we want to talk to, and that there won't be any reprisal. That are the conditions. Otherwise, we're not going to do the visit. If the visit results, probably it will be the last quarter of the year, because before we have General Assembly and Human Rights Council in September. So I have not closed that door yet, but I'm not sure it will happen. I hope it could, but otherwise we are also analyzing other strategies.
And just to finish on a sort of futuristic or forward-looking note, if you were to think about one or two things that could be done over the next 2 or 3 years to really make a difference and improve the prospects for democracy around the world, possibly through the prism of human rights, what would those changes be, or what would those initiatives be?
Well, I mean, one thing that I think would be important is that democracy has to deliver. And it means that, because I've been in countries that they were very happy because they had elections, and after many years, and the former president was not killed or didn't have to go to exile. But at the same time, talking with some parliamentarians, they told me that people said, okay, democracy is important, but you know what? We don't have anything to eat. We don't have a job, etc. Our children are not being educated. We don't have access to health. And so democracy has to deliver, has to mean something special and important for people's life. If that doesn't happen, democracy is not going to be felt like the best political system, understanding that nothing is perfect. So that's one thing, it has to deliver. The second thing is that I think that we need to make participation even bigger. I think people have the right to raise their concerns and participate in shaping the policies that will deeply affect their lives for years. And even in the context of the pandemic, I think this is even more important, because people need to have freedom of press, freedom of information, to really understand why certain measures have been taken and to follow them. And I think people's engagement, and we have seen on the other side, at the local level, a lot of responsibility and commitment and good solutions to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think participation is really key. And I think also it's a human right that must be respected because it works. And as I said before, participation produces better and more sustainable decisions. It allows people to say how they want to be governed. And this is, after all, the essence of democracy, isn't it?
Well, delivery, participation, I think this sets us up very nicely for the rest of the conversation on the future of democracy. Michelle Bachelet, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Daniel. All the best.
Now we're going to go over to our panel session to discuss the future of democracy. We have a very distinguished panel to grapple with these questions. Nathan Law, former legislator and a leader of the Hong Kong umbrella movement, now joining us from London in exile, which says a lot about what's been going on in Hong Kong. Hélène Landemore, professor of political science at Yale University. Richard Wike, Director of Global Attitudes Research at Pew Research Center, and Dawn Nakagawa, Executive Vice President at the Berggruen Institute, which of course does the future of democracy. So a lot to grapple with about the state of play, what's driving the troubles of democracy around the world, what can be done about it, how technology plays into all this. These are some of the questions we're going to grapple with. Perhaps I could turn, Richard, to you first to draw somewhat on Pew's research on how attitudes to democracy have shifted. What are some of the most striking changes that have taken place in recent times?
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks to all the panelists. It's great to be here and have a chance to have this conversation. One of the things that we see in our work is that often there's a lack of commitment to democracy in many parts of the world. It's a popular idea, but people aren't always as committed to it as we might hope. So, when we ask questions about democratic principles, they're very popular. People say they want things like free expression, free press, etc., in their country. But again, they're not as committed to some of those principles as we might think. So, for instance, people often say that they are open to non-democratic alternatives, things like military rule, for instance. Even in supposedly consolidated democracies, we'll see substantial numbers of people who are open to these non-democratic alternatives. We did a survey a few years ago and found that nearly 1 in 5 in places like the U.S. and Italy and France, for example, thought military rule could be a good way to govern their country. Again, we see that the idea of democracy is fairly popular around the globe, but what's worrisome is that people's level of commitment to it maybe isn't always as strong as we thought it might be. And that, I think, lack of commitment can sometimes open up political space, and it can create opportunities for autocrats to take advantage of.
Could we focus just a moment on America, which is often seen as the sort of standard bearer for democracy, the sort of champion of democracy globally, and clearly democracy in America has been troubled in recent times. We had a disputed election in the last cycle. We've had assault on the heartland of democracy in the U.S. Capitol. We've had a lot of controversy over electoral laws. When did you start to see in your research attitudes to democracy changing in America? Is this a relatively recent phenomenon, or is it a trend that you can trace back over many years?
Well, what we see right now is that there's a lot of concern about the functioning of America's political system. We actually did a survey recently in the U.S. as well as in several Western European countries and asked people whether they thought their political system needed to be reformed or not. And you had big majorities in the United States as well as in places like France saying they thought their political system needs major reform or maybe even needs to be completely overhauled. It's also a big part of America's global image right now. We just completed a survey asking people about the United States now that we've had this transition from the Trump to the Biden presidency. And what we see is that America's image has rebounded in many ways. People are much more positive about the U.S. than they were back during the Trump era. But we also see that they have strong concerns about the health of American democracy. And just about every place where we asked the question, people said they thought that America used to be a good example of democracy, but it isn't any longer. So, there's concerns about the health of American democracy in the United States, and there's real doubts right now internationally about the U.S. serving as an example of democracy for others.
Dawn, if I could turn to you on this, you do research as well on the future of democracy. You have your own governance index. Does this resonate? What you're hearing from Richard? Is there a sense of trouble in America that causes that echoes and resonates around the world and causes erosion of trust in democracy more broadly?
Certainly. Yes. And thank you, Daniel. And thank you to The Economist for including me in this. The tragedy of American democracy being where it is right now in terms of the perception worldwide is that it does put into question democracy as a system of governments altogether. For many people, America, around the world, America was a shining light. And so its democratic ills and the way the system has been sort of stuck more or less in this gridlock and this zero-sum game for a couple of decades at least now, I think is not just a tragedy for democracy, but for not just a tragedy for the United States, but for democracy around the world and how democracy is perceived. America's problems are deep, and there are many, many ways that the system would need to be changed, I think, if it were to re-legitimize democracy itself and fix the problems that it has. And those stem from too much money in politics, to the fact that we only have a two-party system and it's become a zero-sum game, to the fact that the political parties use depriving people of their votes as a political strategy. There are just a number of issues that I think America would have to address in order to fix its own problems and re-legitimize democracy itself. I think, but there's a broader set of questions here that we should hopefully get into in this discussion, which is that democracy itself needs to be adapted to the era that it's living in, right? And we're trying to govern a people that has changed and a time that has changed quite significantly. And the systems of government that we have and the systems of democracy that we have don't really reflect those changes. Until we start to address those, I think that democracy will continue to stumble and feel unstable, and people will be afraid, and therefore they will be looking for alternatives, like Richard brought up. People will think that the strongman, authoritarian government, even military dictatorship may be favorable to the instability they feel because, or the fear they feel because of the instability in their democracy.
I just want to probe a little bit about how acute the problem is at the moment, because there's a sense to which, we've spent a lot of time in America. Let's continue with America before panning out. But the founding fathers in America foresaw this in a way. They were very nervous in framing the Constitution about all the threats to democracy. The Constitution was at every point mindful of this, and it is a question of sort of eternal vigilance, checks and balances. In a sense, you have to worry about it. Part of the game of keeping a democracy strong is its constant renewal. So you can never, in a way, never let up and relax. And if you did, and if everybody on this panel was saying everything's fine, that would be a problem in itself. So how much should we worry about the fact that we're worried, or should we rejoice a little bit about the fact that we're worried? I don't wish to make that sound complacent, but worrying about democracy is part of democracy, surely.
Can I answer that? Is that for me?
Yeah, that was meant for you, Dawn. Sorry, I should have made that clear.
Yeah, no, actually, it's interesting that you say that, because I do think we're having a crisis moment here, and there is a lot that needs to change. The upside on that is the fact that there are so many people engaged in this conversation, and there's great work being done. There's an enormous amount of innovation in democracy right now. And because of technology, which, again, I hope we'll get into a little bit how technology itself is part of that destabilization that we're feeling. But technology also offers us the opportunity to do so much and to sort of reinvent our democracy in ways that allow for broad and deep citizen engagement. And I do believe that's the path forward. So I think the fact that we're worried, the fact that we're aware that there's an issue, and this growing awareness is turning into a lot of activity, a lot of research, a lot of study, and a lot of innovation. I think that's all a good thing, and I think that's exactly where we need to go if we're going to preserve the values of democracy that we hold dear.
Yes, I mean, one measure of strength might be, voting turnout, and of course that was high in the latest American election by historical American standards, which is perhaps not the best benchmark for this, but still, it's a measure of the engagement in politics. Hélène, if I could turn to you, we talk about democracy, but I wonder whether that's in a sense doing ourselves a disservice, because we mean a lot of the different things by it. Different countries interpret it in different ways, and it's not just about the act of voting. There's all sorts of activity and culture goes into a well-functioning democracy. So is our vocabulary, in a sense, letting us down here? Should we have a more textured conversation about what we mean by democracy and how strong or how much trouble it is?
Thank you, Daniel, for the question, and thank you to the Economist for including me in this conversation. Indeed, I do think that it would be good to have a conversation about what democracy means, what it's meant so far, and what it should mean going forward, because people lump under that term a lot of things: the rule of law, liberal rights, the constitutional order, majoritarian responsiveness, accountability, this and that. But I think you can have many of those things and still not have a true democracy. And I find that, when we look back at the history of modern so-called representative democracies, they were not intended as democracies. We started calling them that much later in the game, around 1830 in the US, around 1870 in Great Britain. They were meant to be liberal republican republics. Or elected governments, representative governments. And that didn't include participation by the people, mass referenda or any sort of direct democracy mechanism. And there's a real question as to whether you can have an authentic democracy without these things, without actually involving the people rather than elected representatives, such that people do more in this system than just vote every 4 years. So I think that, to my mind, the so-called crisis of democracy, it's partly a moment of realization that the systems we call representative democracies are not sufficiently democratic, if democratic at all, and that we want more, we deserve more, and that if we want good governance for the people, we'll have to have governance by the people and not by elected elites. So, I have a much more radical view on this, I suppose, than many of you on this panel, but I've become convinced that the US is no longer a democracy, perhaps never was one. And if you look at what political scientists tell us, a basic sort of criterion to call a system a democracy would be that it's minimally responsive to majoritarian preferences. But apparently in the US, majorities are not causally efficient anymore, if they ever were. That's really worrying, very worrying. And the sort of massive inequalities that we see economically and otherwise, the lack of inclusiveness, the lack of true equality, true political equality, I think these are all signs of a regime that has come much closer to, you might say, a plutocracy, ruled by economic elites than an authentic rule by the people.
So if I could, clearly you're throwing down the gauntlet there. You're challenging the very nature of, a lot of what people would assume is democracy, and where the sort of leading examples of it are. Is there a place where you would say that your democratic ideal comes closest to being a reality? What does it look like, or does it only really exist in theory at the moment?
Well, I would think that Switzerland comes close. It's a semi-direct federal republic where people actually vote on issues directly. They don't just vote for people who are then going to make decisions for them. They decide regularly. There's like 3 to 4 referenda a year. They, have an active engagement with the local politics, also because the fact is that it's a very decentralized country. So I think this is closer to an ideal of authentic self-rule, even though it's also very electoral, because they gave up on the use of random selection. which was something practiced in Switzerland for a long time, for centuries, until the mid-19th century. But then they started copying the French model, the French constitutional system, and so they stopped using that. So, but to my mind, electoral systems tend to be by nature oligarchic, and so in that sense, there is no real democracy in the world at this point.
No real democracy in the world. Well, Nathan, we can talk about theory, but you've had very practical impact of non-democracy. You, as we said, you're in exile in London because of the turn, not so much from democracy. No one would claim Hong Kong was a democracy, but towards authoritarianism very sharply in China and quite scarily in recent times. So how does it look from your perspective as a country and a movement that you helped to lead, the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, that aspired to greater democracy and has seen it actually move in the other direction to the extent that you've had to flee the country and live outside it? Does this discussion resonate with you at the sharp end of an effort to create some sort of democratic system in Hong Kong?
Thank you, Daniel, for the question, and also I'm very honored to be part of this panel. Yeah, I agree that we are all approximating the essence of democracy. Is a never-ending project. So it's difficult to say that there is a perfect democratic system now, but we can definitely see what are the undemocratic ones and what tends to incline to a totalitarian one. Hong Kong is a perfect example to demonstrate that the lack of democracy could make our freedoms and our system and our rule of law very fragile to the attacks of the dictators. If you look back Hong Kong, like for 6 years, when we were talking about fighting for democracy, and for now we are coming to a point that a lot of our way of life and the institutions that we thought that we are enjoying are being crushed by the Chinese Communist Party with an incredible speed. I think the core reason is we have never had any electoral system that could truly represent people, and the Chinese government is reforming Hong Kong's electoral politics to a form. They're having an overhaul that they will minimize the participation of direct election. And in the next legislature, we will only have less than 30% of the legislators are through direct election, and their candidacy are being vetted by political police. Furthermore, our chief executive, they are directly appointed by the central government instead of Hong Kong people. So we are in a state that we used to believe we enjoy certain freedoms, like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. There had been annual and massive rallies of Hong Kong before 2019, every year since 1997, when Hong Kong's sovereignty was handed back from the British government to the Chinese government. But all these freedoms that we tend to enjoy are crushed in just several months of time after Beijing has implemented the national security law in Hong Kong and crushed all the freedoms that we enjoy in the name of protecting the national security. So definitely it is a story that tells how fragile our freedoms are if we don't have a functioning democracy, and if we can let the authoritarian government to get into our social fabrics and to implement the philosophy of a power hegemon, which they no longer practicing division of power. They're crushing our civil society. They want to grab all the authorities in their hands. Then we are in a big trouble. I think this is a lesson learned by the world, and we've definitely learned how the authoritarian governments crush our civil societies by examining what had happened in Hong Kong for the past few months.
And what have you concluded is the way then to respond to this? Clearly the Chinese state is extremely strong, seems to be ever more confident and assertive in imposing its system, certainly in Hong Kong and to some extent in a broader area beyond China as well. How can the world respond to this in a way that might reverse some of these changes that you've been talking about? Is it to do with presenting a common front, or are there more specific actions that you think could be taken?
Well, I think we just need an awakening, which we have to recognize that for the past few decades, a lot of political commentators or politicians in democratic countries, when they assessed China's path, they made a wrong prediction. They thought that China would step into a classic modernization path when there is a rise of middle class, a rise of income, then there would probably be an emergence of rule of law and then to become a democratic place. So for the past few decades, we have had that prediction, and including the US and European countries, we engaged with China with appeasement strategy, with trade to change, all sorts of things based on that theory, so that we grow China and to current states that it is the second largest economy in the world. But during the time, we didn't really implement any measures that hold them accountable for the human rights violation. And for China, they have abused the technology, the total control, in order to curtail all the information and also make all the narrative in mainland China to be one form, which is the one propaganda by the Chinese government. So I think it's important that we recognize that mistake and we have a perceptual change. We need to understand that for the past 2 decades of global democratic recession, the rise of Chinese authoritarianism and its growing assertiveness and aggression plays a big part in it. And if we don't see it as a crisis, then we are handicapped to make any change. We just need to see that rise of authoritarianism as a global crisis, just like climate emergency, like poverty, and any other problems that we are facing together with other parts of the world. And we have to come up with global agendas, global actions, or even institutions to strategize ourselves in order to curb their influence and to promote democracy, not only domestically, but also worldwide.
So I think if I could summarize where we've got so far, it's a general sense that things are in a very imperfect state in the world as far as democracy is concerned, and a general sense that if anything, things are going in the wrong direction rather than in the right direction. We've had a few hints of what the trouble may be, and you know, we've heard about geopolitics just now, we heard about inequality and a lack of responsiveness. But I want to try to understand and probe your views. Why now? Why have things been taking, after a period when things looked quite positive for the trends of democracy, and for a number of years, particularly after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, the end of the Cold War. Why have things gone backwards? Is it economic? Is it generational? Is it technological? Is it a combination of all these things? Richard, what are your polls telling you? What do people ascribe it to?
Yeah, you know, I think there is a lot of things that are driving the dissatisfaction many people feel with the way democracy is working, the way their political systems are working. You know, if you look at social science in recent years, there are a lot of studies out there trying to understand people's political frustrations, what's driving the rise of populism around the world and things like that. Often they look at economic factors and cultural factors. Sometimes they'll pit economics and culture sort of against one another to see which one's more important. You know, I think both are certainly important. Issues around identity are certainly important. Concerns and anxieties about the long-term economic future are driving.
But my point is, why is the identity thing arisen now, for example, as opposed to some time 15, 20 years ago? It seems to grow more acute. Or what explains the sense of acuteness, almost crisis, that we have now?
Yeah. Well, you know, I would argue that beyond the sort of, or, you know, in addition to culture, economics, these things, there's some distinctly political factors as well. People just don't feel like their systems are working well, maybe consistent with some of the things Elena said. They don't see representation working very well. They feel like, the system itself is unfair. Elites have too much power. People don't have an adequate voice in, making decisions that affect their lives. So, beyond the sort of economic inequality, beyond these cultural grievances people have, there's some things about our politics that aren't working well in people's minds. And that's been increasingly true in recent years. And I think that feeds a lot of the resentment and frustrations that people have. And it feeds this desire for reform and change that many people have.
Dawn, would you add to that list of why now?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting line of questioning, and it's a very difficult one to answer. I think overall, and no offense to social science research, we do a lot of it and we rely on it a great deal. But I think trying to get people to identify what it is that's not working, or what is the cause of their satisfaction, I think is a difficult thing to do. I think there's more of a general perception that government is not functioning the way the rest of the world does. If you think about it, our society has evolved a lot, right? Our expectations about how the world works has evolved a lot. We are a sort of real-time, customized, I have a big voice kind of world now. And government still operates in a way where you elect your representative. If you don't like what you bought, you can return it 4 years later. It's not very responsive in the meantime, and so on and on and on. And it's not just the electoral processes like that. It's basically every interaction you have with government, for the most part, is not really living up to the expectations of kind of the world I live in now. And so I think there's this general perception that government is not responsive and it's not keeping up and it's just not working. I think the other thing is that we are our representative government and worked for a society that was very hierarchical, right? I mean, we lived in societies where hierarchies were determined by our relationship to power and our relationship to information. And as long as information was controlled at the top, the narrative was controlled by those who were at the top, and those people had the power and the resources, really that concentration kept the system stable. It wasn't fair and it wasn't inclusive, but it was more or less stable. Now our relationship with information has changed drastically, and it's not the people who have, are inaccessible at the top that have the information and have the power. It's actually the people with the most access to the most people who have the power. And so the dynamics of our system are changing as we move from a hierarchical society and more into a network, which is sort of where we're moving towards. The dynamics have changed entirely, and the narrative is not controlled, and information the system's flooded with information. And so my sense is that people's perception of what's not working is in part just the chaos of the world they're living in now, right? There isn't a controlled narrative. There's not a shared sense of reality. There's a very fragmented sense of reality, a lot of misinformation out there, and this general sense that nobody's in control. And I think that that's what's leading to the fear. And of course, they're going to look for somebody to blame. I'm not saying government isn't to blame. I mean, they have a lot to do with it. But I think that their dissatisfaction is driven much more by these phenomena in the system than they are to any one thing that they can point to about government or about democracy that's not working.
I think that's a very good point, but it leads to a kind of paradox. And Hélène, perhaps you'd comment on this, that what you're describing is, in a sense, information becoming more democratic, without a sort of control at the top, more of a free-for-all. And yet people's frustrations with democracy growing. So is that a fair description, that the more that there is a democracy of access, if you like, to at least to different opinions, the more people seem to get frustrated with the system and the way it's performing? Hélène,
yes,
would you like to?
Yeah, I would like to sort of venture a hypothesis about why now we're having this crisis. I think it's the sort of a moment where we're at the end of a period of a hyper-capitalist globalization that has basically eviscerated state sovereignty and the power of democracies to self-organize and redistribute the pie somewhat fairly, or at least buy social peace, even if it's not done in fully democratic ways. But at least elites had a way to keep a certain order that way. But now they've been under a pressure of competition and the implementation of neoliberal policies, and so a lot of the power has gone. The economic sovereignty has considerably diminished, and so they haven't been able to buy social peace the way they used to be able to. Meanwhile, you've got these new technologies, these new social media, the internet, etc., that have sort of reduced the pluralist ignorance we had about each other, about each other's views on power, about the distribution of riches in the world. Now you can, some people say that Google Maps is partly the reason why you had the Arab Spring, because people in Egypt started seeing, the swimming pools of the rich people, they could see them, and that fed a sort of resentment. So all these media that make people understand better the world they're in, understand themselves better, have a desire for self-expression, and also the possibility in this market to get instant feedback or give instant feedback on products and movies and things like that. And then somehow, and this is what Don was saying, you don't get to do that for government, because government is a very slow-moving 18th century construct where you only have to, one input every 4 years, and then in between, nothing. So that creates a huge amount of frustration. You've got a government that's impotent, doesn't deliver the goods anymore, and meanwhile, you could say things, or you can jump in and contribute, and you have Rotten Tomatoes where you can give instant feedback on movies, but somehow government, it's still this slow-moving train, that it's frustrating everyone, I think.
Nathan, to pick up that point, and I have another question I'd like to ask you as well related to the reasons, but the effectiveness of government. I mean, Hélène is saying, government is non-responsive, it's slow-moving. You only get the chance every 4 years, if you do get a proper chance to vote. And obviously, in Hong Kong, that's never really happened with a fully free choice, and even less so now. But isn't part of the argument, at least on the part of an authoritarian state like China, that its government is effective, is efficient, and has been delivering the goods in many ways for many years? And the Chinese government says, "Look at us, we're working. We're a more attractive form of efficient management than chaotic democracies." Now, clearly, that's not a view that appeals to democratic supporters in Hong Kong, but it seems to be a view that resonates to some extent, and that the Chinese government finds one that brings it some success around the world.
Well, I think governance is a continued renovating process. It's so difficult for us to keep a certain mindset for the challenges of the new era that we're facing now, and in terms of the authoritarian government claiming themselves of having high efficiency, I think that it's just a huge ideological play in that narrative. The most important thing is when we listen to narratives about China, there is barely we can find any alternative, because all the problems in mainland China are being shielded. Then they're unable to express themselves online. The speech are all screened. The only narrative that you can have access and to understand in general what is happening in mainland China are from the mouthpiece of the Chinese communist regime. Even though we've been seeing a period of a lift of poverty and see many good governance, but in effect, we just can't omit that there were a long period of time in China they were in the famine, there were a lot of people died because of poor governance. That period was also under an extreme totalitarian regime. And for now, there are a lot of human rights violations that are happening just under our nose. In Xinjiang, millions of people are in concentration camp branded in the name of re-education camp. There are people suffering in Hong Kong daily, which is difficult to access to these information just because the capacity and capability of a digital totalitarian government that they could conceal facts from people. And I think it really echoes to the discussion we have had about social media, about people being a product now. They have to sell themselves, and they have a better access to information about how wealthy people live their life, how much difficulties and barriers they have when they want to climb up the social ladder. And that anxiety and that insecurity may be triggering someone to look into an alternative system, which actually they have no knowledge of, because all the description about that system are produced by the totalitarian government that only portray the better side of it. So I think that contrast, I think there are lots of ideology disguised in place, but also destabilize people's perception towards the differences of a democratic system and an authoritarian system.
So how much of this do you think is a generational phenomenon that, I mean, clearly in Hong Kong, it was striking how young people were leading the charge. You're a very good example of this, but the leaders of the umbrella movement were very, and the democratic movement more generally were strikingly young. And there seemed to be a sense of frustration at a number of levels, at the political level, but also at the economic level, that getting onto the ladder was not going to be easy in Hong Kong. So is the generational fact an important one here in Hong Kong and beyond in expectations of what democracy should and could be?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I think generation indeed play a part of it, but I think there are a lot of assets that cut across the problem. For example, your class background. A lot of anxieties are from working class because the emergence of AI, the workflow change, the change of a production line, etc. There are actually a lot of changes happening in the society, and seemingly the government is not responding them, and it's not providing solutions to tell the people that under that form of governance, you can enjoy your rights and you could perhaps fulfill your expectation of all sorts of aspects of your life. And I think this is, well, to be honest, relying on such a giant machine, a train, to respond to all these demands and changes. It is seemingly unreliable solution. We just need a civil society that is strong enough, that is responsive enough, that is deep embedded into the social fabrics enough in order for us to solve their problems, and that civil society should be supported by the government, who is democratic and responsive and accountable. But for now, if we look into Hong Kong as an example of how an undemocratic government that can crush the civil societies, a lot of our unions are being banned and dissolved just because the government doesn't like them. A lot of our NGOs are forced to lay low or even disband. They're moving out of Hong Kong because the government is targeting all those NGOs who are supporting democratic movement or perhaps working with some international NGOs. And there are a lot of different things happening in Hong Kong that shows under a totalitarian regime, a regime that aims at centralizing all powers, the civil society is crushed. And I think that is exactly what a democratic country or society, on the contrary, that we should preserve and culture.
So we've heard a lot about what's wrong, but what about what could be put right? What about potential policies, potential solutions? And I guess that here, technology is something that comes into play. There should be lots more possibilities opened up by technology, although, as we've heard, also technology can be part of the problem as well. So what about ideas for doing things better? And Dawn, perhaps start with you here, because I know that's something that you look into a lot, trying to figure out what the future might hold and how it might be improved.
So yes, our Future of Democracy program has spent a lot of time looking at this. When we started probably in 2015, 2016, very concerned about what we were seeing online and what impact it would have on democratic norms. And we were seeing it wasn't just misinformation, it was really toxic political dialogue. It was a lot of incivility. It was a sort of outrage machine. It was, if you could say, whoever said the most outrageous thing was going to get all the attention, which of course was skewing the political dialogue towards the extremes and so on. And we started to research this and brought it to the attention of policymakers, most of whom were studying very hard and working very hard at figuring out how to use social media to win their next election, as Obama had done in 2008. So they weren't paying much attention, and they weren't listening very much to what we were saying, and we were very concerned about it at the time. But after a few years, and of course that conversation picked up after Brexit, after Trump won the election, people were starting to pay quite a bit of attention of what was happening on the platform, how the digital public square had really become the space where political dialogue was taking place and what effect that was having. And there was some really good work done to research and try to figure out and explore what was happening there and what could be done about it. I would say, though, that in the years since, it doesn't feel like a lot has been done about it. And the negative externalities of those problems are being felt acutely and at scale now. If you look at what happened on January 6th, and in the aftermath, 20% of the American population believing that attack was justified, our problems of misinformation have really reached a scale where they've transitioned into a different kind of problem. It's not just more of the same. We actually have to look at different ways to address this, because the conversations we've been having for the last 3 years about moderating content are really not going to get us to where we need to be to solve this. Now, with that said, I bring all that up because about 3 years into that conversation, we moved our attention away from trying to fix content moderation or misinformation or do these targeted attacks on these specific problems that were popping up with social media, and actually really turned our attention to reform of our democracy. The fact is, our information ecosystem is never going back to what it was, and what we need are institutions that are resilient to this new reality, because that reality is going to persist. So how do we build institutions that are resilient? How do we build a democracy that is legitimate in the eyes of the people? And we really turned our attention to looking at ways to broaden and deepen citizens' engagement. I think this goes back to Helene's point. We are kind of at a point where, because of technology, we can actually achieve democracy for and by the people in a way that was never available to us before, unless we were living in a village of about 150 people. Now that there are tools out there that will allow us to do it. And so what we started to do was experiment at almost every sort of stage of the governance supply chain, thinking from like, what should our legislative priorities be, to, and crowdsourcing those, to figuring out how we can, bringing citizens together to figure out some nuanced solutions, to bringing them to the ballot, to whatever. And we started looking at all these different ways of utilizing technology to broaden and deepen citizens' engagement. On the other side of that, however, we also have to have a massive effort in a new kind of civics education. It's not just about, the functions of government, but it's actually teaching citizens to speak to each other and to listen to each other, and to listen well and disagree well, and come to a solution, even though you're at the table brokering something with somebody whose values you don't share. We want to be an inclusive society. We have to be an inclusive democracy if this is going to work. But that requires an entirely new skill set and an entirely new civic architecture to our society. So it's not a small challenge. Technology itself is not going to solve this. But I do believe that that there is the opportunity, and we should be working on it now, because I think if we start working in earnest now, we might might meet the moment and actually achieve the democracy we've always promised ourselves, but never quite achieved yet.
Hélène, I have a sense that probably that resonates with what you were saying, but maybe you'd be even more radical. You were talking about a sort of wholesale redesign of the system and sort of throw up all the pieces. So how much further would you go?
So my view is that technology is not the answer as much as the political theory we bring to political reforms going forward, possibly using technology. Because if you simply digitize a flawed system or you augment it with artificial intelligence or other tools, well, you still have a flawed system made worse in a way, because then you can do more damage more efficiently and quickly. So I've become convinced that, as long as we stay in this constitutional framework of highly partisan electoral politics, nothing will change. You can have, all the social media tweaking you want. You can try to educate people about behaving better on the internet. Nothing will change. So I think it's really important to pause and think about what we want to apply new technologies to. So, for example, online voting could be great, right? If we can crack the security issues around it. And then you'd hopefully bring in more people and it would be easier and there would be higher participation. But again, it won't change anything to the fundamentally oligarchic nature of electoral democracy in the US and elsewhere. So for me, we need to rethink the fundamentals. And the main way to rethink the fundamentals for me is to center ordinary citizens by creating a so-called House of the People. That would be, a house of several hundred people selected at random, where people would come for extended duration to talk to each other and set an agenda for the polity and possibly legislate together. And this would be truly deliberative as opposed to sort of posturing, rhetoric and scoring of points that goes on in actual parliaments. And there technologies can help because you want this sort of body to be self-aware and have all the tools they need to connect to the larger public. So crowdsourcing platforms, like Don was saying, tools like what they use in Taiwan, like it's called V-Taiwan. It's a set of platforms and methods to collect input from the larger public and track emerging consensus among them on salient issues like the place of Airbnb and other corporations in the local ecology economy. So I think that there, once you have a good framework, a good political theory of what the system should be, then you can use GI and other things to reinvent governance and reach out to more people, perhaps create structures for global governance. But if we think that, because at some point we'll have to have a form of global governance, the current international system, to tackle things like climate change, north-south inequalities, things like that. If we simply replicate electoral politics on a global scale, we're headed for a disaster. Campaigns will cost billions and billions of dollars. We will end up with a global sort of body of mostly male, rich people from the West. And this is not the sort of like global order we want. So as long as we stay stuck in this 18th century vision of democracy, which is really, in fact, an elected oligarchy of sorts, we are not going to make progress. So that's why I'm calling for a bolder sort of rethinking of the whole thing.
Okay, well, fascinating, stimulating thought. We're not going to redesign democracy just in the space of these few minutes that remain to us, but you've certainly thrown out the challenge. We've also had some really good questions come in from the audience. So I'd like to turn to one or two of those for the time that is left to us. The first one is that President Biden has an idea for a summit of democracies. Is this a good idea, and how can it have a positive impact on democracy? Nathan, perhaps I'll put that to you. How important is it that democratic countries come together, whether it's a summit of democracies of sort of the Biden plans or some other form? Do you see hope in that? It's obviously not a redesigning of the system, but it's an assertion of the importance of democratic values.
Well, definitely having a democracy summit is important, but not in a form that all the global leaders coming out and reiterate what they have said or what are their stance. but it's a golden opportunity to engage with the civil society and with the people, and to think about how we can make our democracy more direct, and through a means of interacting with people who have the agency and who have the ambition to empower people to make it more on the ground and making people feel less insecure. I think it is a peculiar era that we're living in. We have never wanted attention like before with the emergence of social media, but we are getting more and more feeling we are not listened. We're not listened by the government. We're not listened by the people who make policy. And I think that anxiety, we have to address them with concrete things. And the Democracy Summit is a starting point. I hope that summit is not another form of kind of like formal exhibition of the stance from policymakers or from the government. It should be a people's assembly, and it should be heavily focusing on civil society affairs and the concerns that they're bringing up. And that is the way that we could make our democracy better, by truly listening to them.
We have a number of questions that come around business, corporate involvement in democracy, the money aspect of it, billions and billions raised and spent by candidates. One question asked, how can corporate interference with democracy be curbed? But of course, the question seems to me to be even more complicated than that, because many corporate leaders feel now compelled by their customers to take a stance on political issues and get drawn into political debate. So it's not so easy to stand apart from, particularly in the United States, current political issues. Richard, what does the research at Pew tell you about attitudes towards corporate engagement in politics, or trust in corporates as political actors?
Well, I think when you're talking about, trust in corporate actors, it probably fits into, the overall pattern of a lack of trust in sort of key institutions in society, right? There's a lack of trust often in the media in certain countries, or in business, or in government. So, it's not just sort of trust in one sector or another. It's an overall pattern of a lack of trust, a lack of trust people have in elites in general, right? Which I think, relates to a lot of these frustrations and things we've talked about, that people don't feel represented. They don't feel like the system is fair, either in terms of economic power or political power. So, when you're talking about trust in business, I think it's part of this larger pattern of distrust in various powerful institutions within society.
Yeah, we also have some questions around the media and difficulty of having unbiased news in the current environment. So, how central to the to the future of democracy is a more effective or healthier media environment, and what can you actually do about that? Dawn, do you want to tackle that one?
Well, when we were preparing for this, one of the questions in I guess the program design was, if you had a magic wand, what would you use it to fix? And I have to say, it's the fourth estate. I think it's the biggest problem we have. How do we have an effective democracy, one where an informed public can engage and participate effectively without a media ecosystem that is providing good quality, high quality information? I think it's a very, very difficult problem to solve, and I don't underestimate the importance of ensuring or of trying to solve it. Although I'm not very optimistic that we will be able to. That's my honest opinion. With that said, I think there are some good ideas out there. I think there should be public interest journalism available, so it's not all tied up in corporate money and political interest and bias. I think that there are ways to create signals in the system to identify, even if it's even if it's from a sort of crowdsourced way, information that is good quality versus information that isn't. There's been a lot of discussion about educating people to be more discriminating about what they're reading and learning how to read it. I have sort of mixed views on that, but it's probably an important part of it. So I think the project is incredibly important, and we can't underestimate it. If the project is to include more people in the process, to create a real citizens' democracy where people participate and feel like they're heard, then I think it's really important that they also have access to really good information. And one of the things that's happened in the last 6 years, not only the collapse of local journalism, which is very problematic, because when your local newspaper disappears, you become invisible. That's how it feels to these communities. And so the sense of loss and disconnect from government and from the rest of the society becomes quite acute. I think it's one of the things we've seen in a lot of these rural towns across America, where there's a sense of hopelessness has gone through the roof and the deaths of despair have increased rapidly. It's not the whole story, but it's part of it. Nobody's telling their story. So I do think there are things that we have to do with local journalism and public interest journalism if we're going to be a society that is inclusive, and that to which we are inviting more and more voices.
Great. Well, but I like you having waved your magic wand. Perhaps you could pass your wand over to Nathan, and Nathan, you could tell us what would be your wish for. It's clearly, there's not one thing that's magically going to change, but in an ideal world, what would you wish could change?
Well, I think definitely the most pressing. I think the most pressing problem is still the complacency that we have when we deal with authoritarian governments, and we are not aware of its infiltration and how they mingle in our democratic system in order to discredit it. And also for our, for example, the resistance movement around the world, they're not being seen as much as we wanted because of a lot of different reasons. So I think it is important for us to craft a narrative or craft a perception that all these human rights violations around the world, they should not be singled out. It is a collective phenomenon, and we have to deal with them collectively. And for these human rights abuses, they should not be escaping from their responsibility just by claiming that it's their internal affairs or sovereignty issue. We are all human beings, and when we suffer, we feel the same. So I think this is important that we see it as a global crisis, and we work with it with our international organizations and international measures.
Thank you, Richard. Can I hand the virtual wand over to you? How would you use it?
Well, I think it'd be interesting to have, a season of democratic innovation in a way. We certainly see that the crisis in confidence in liberal democracy has opened people up to, I think, in different ways, new possibilities, and there's interest, I think, in different ways and new ways of conducting democracy. So innovation and experimentation, may be the way forward to figure out how to make democracy work. And I'd add one thing that I think is somewhat related based on some of the things maybe building up what Nathan has talked about. We don't see a lot of appeal for the authoritarian model, for the kind of model that China's government is trying to offer. We in addition to conducting research on what people around the world think about the United States, we've also now for a decade and a half been asking what they think about China. And attitudes towards China have hit an all-time low in most of the countries that we regularly survey over the last couple of years. And a big reason for that is that people have strong concerns about China's human rights record. So the problem for democracies isn't necessarily that people are turning towards an authoritarian model. The problem is more that people don't see democracies working well. They like democratic principles, they don't believe those principles are always being lived up to, and they don't always see democracies working effectively. So, that brings me back to the idea of experimentation and innovation, figuring out new ways to make democracy deliver, I think, is one of the ways it's going to make the future of democracy more promising.
Hélène, you get the last use of the wand. It rests with you, but very briefly because we're running out of time.
So very briefly, I think we can afford to go past the experimentation phase and the institutionalization phase at this point. I think we've tried various kinds of ways to include citizens through mini public, citizens assembly, citizen juries, crowdsourcing, great national debates like the one we had in France. I think now it's time to think of constitutional reforms to structurally augment electoral systems, since we can't really abolish them, with the wisdom of the many, the liberation of representative sample of the larger population, and complement all of that with, importantly, direct democracy mechanism like citizens' initiative, so that people can actually put things on the agenda, put things on the table of parliament, and perhaps other things like rights of referral, so that when the law is not making people happy, they can actually call for a referendum to abolish it, or recall procedures where you're not happy with an elected official, they can be recalled. These are all things that should be on the table for discussion at this point, I think.
Thank you. Well, if I had my magic wand, I would wave it and prolong this conversation by at least another hour, because we've only, I think, started to get into the really interesting solutions to this. But we've had a fascinating conversation. I think we've heard how important it is to raise awareness of these problems. We've had thoughts about redesigning the whole system. We've heard several reasons for the problems that exist, and lots and lots of perspectives on the design flaws that exist in the democracies as they're practiced at the moment, and also the abuse of power by various groups, including geopolitically at the nation state level. But lots to engage with. There are also other questions that we haven't got to, or we'll hope, I think, beyond this conversation to try to get to those. If you've asked a question and we haven't got to it, to answer you afterwards. So the conversation will continue. But meanwhile, I'd just like to thank all of our panelists for such an engaging debate, and also Pew for its support for this event. So thank you very much. And all I can say is, on democracy, to be continued, most definitely. Thank you.